When we first found the house on Orchard Lane, it felt like a dream come true. My wife, Josephine, and I had been searching for a quiet place to settle down with our 2 young kids, Oliver and Sophie. And this charming 2-story home at the edge of the woods seemed perfect. It was isolated, surrounded by acres of forest, and had a view of a small, misty lake from the back porch. At first, everything seemed perfect. But the strangeness began within days of moving in. The kids were the first to notice. Oliver, only 7, would often complain about the man in the yard. At first, I thought he was just being imaginative, but every time I went to check, I'd find nothing outside. I chalked it up to shadows or perhaps someone passing through on the trail near the woods. I tried to reassure him, but something about his expression unsettled me. He wasn't just being playful, he was genuinely afraid. Then came the scratching. At first it was soft, like the creaking of old pipes, and we assumed it was just the house settling. But as the days passed, it grew louder, insistent, like nails raking across wood. It always came at night, long after the kids were asleep, as if something was clawing its way through the walls. Josephine and I tried everything, calling pest control, checking every inch of the house, but there was nothing. No evidence of animals, no damaged pipes, nothing. Then, one evening, Josephine called me into the kids' room. She stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, pointing to the closet. I listened, and there it was, a faint scratching coming from within the closet walls. Oliver was huddled under his covers, his eyes wide with terror. "It's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He wants to come in." Josephine and I didn't sleep that night, lying awake, listening to the scratching that seemed to move throughout the walls of the house, circling us. The next morning, I found Josephine in the living room, staring at the photographs we'd hung on the walls. There was something off about them. Each face in the photos, every member of our family, looked slightly distorted. Shadows fell across our faces in unnatural ways, and there was a darkness behind each pair of eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if the photographs had changed overnight, reflecting a side of us I didn't recognize. By the end of the week, I began hearing voices. They were faint, like whispers carried on a breeze. I'd hear my name called when I was alone in a room, or the children's laughter echoing down empty hallways. One evening, I was certain I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, standing just outside Oliver's room. A tall, dark silhouette, with a face that seemed half-formed like shadows clinging to skin. I sprinted down the hall, but by the time I reached Oliver's room, it was gone. We were too scared to stay, but Josephine insisted we couldn't just leave. "This is our home," she argued, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "We'll figure it out. It has to be something explainable." But the night we tried to confront it was the night everything changed. Josephine woke me in the middle of the night, shaking my shoulder. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she pointed down the hallway. It's in the kids' room," she stammered. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and rushed down the hall. As I neared the door, I heard whispering, a low, rhythmic chant, as if someone were reciting a dark lullaby. I could barely make out the words, but there was a venom in the voice that made my skin crawl. The kids were fast asleep, but the room was freezing, as if a cold wind was blowing from nowhere. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the flashlight beam, stood the shadowy figure, its face contorted in a hideous grin. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits that seemed to swallow the light. I tried to shout, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it turned its gaze on me, raising one long, shadowy arm and pointing directly at my chest. In that moment, I felt a searing pain in my heart, like icy fingers clawing their way into my soul. Somehow, I managed to break free, grabbing the kids and dragging them back to our bedroom. Josephine was in a panic, clutching her chest as if she, too, felt the same icy grip. We didn't sleep that night, huddled together in terror, waiting for the dawn to come. The next day, I decided we needed help. I reached out to a local historian, someone who knew the area's folklore and might be able to explain what was happening. When I mentioned the house, his voice grew quiet. "That house," he said, "has been abandoned for decades. It's known around here as the Cursed House. They say a man was killed there, back in the 1800s. A traveller passing through, murdered in his sleep. His body was never found, but people say his spirit haunts the land, bound to the house." That evening, I told Josephine everything, and she agreed that we couldn't stay. But it seemed that the house didn't want us to leave. As we packed, the lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to pulse and shift. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and we heard the whispers again, louder, more insistent. "We can't leave," Josephine whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's in the house. It won't let us go." Then, as if in answer, the walls began to bleed. Dark, thick liquid seeped from the cracks, staining the paint, pooling on the floor. Josephine backed away, covering her mouth as a low, mocking laughter echoed through the house. Desperate, I grabbed the kids, pulling them toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it felt as if an unseen force was holding it shut. Then I remembered the cellar. I rushed to the basement, hoping there'd be a way out. But when I opened the door, I found myself staring at a strange symbol painted on the wall. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. A twisted, demonic face, surrounded by symbols that seemed to pulsate with malevolence. I felt a surge of anger, as if the house itself was mocking me. "We're leaving," I shouted, but the laughter only grew louder, reverberating through the walls. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the basement window, breaking it open. I hoisted the kids through, then Josephine, and climbed out after them. We ran to the car, not looking back, feeling as if the house itself was watching us, waiting for us to return. We drove until we were miles away, collapsing in a motel room, too exhausted to even speak. We never went back. I arranged for our belongings to be moved, unwilling to set foot in that place again. It's been months now, and though we're in a new home, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of faint whispers, and in the corner of my vision, I catch a glimpse of that same shadowy figure, its hollow eyes watching, waiting, as if the house was still calling us back, refusing to let us go. When we moved into our new house, we thought it would be a fresh start. The place was a secluded, old colonial farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town, nestled deep in the woods. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, rustic home my wife, Nora, and I had dreamed about. But it didn't take long for us to notice something was wrong. It started with strange noises. We'd hear scratching, no, more like scraping, in the walls, like something clawing its way out. At first, we thought it was just squirrels or raccoons in the attic. I checked every corner, every crawl space, and even laid out traps, but there was no sign of any animal. Still, the scratching persisted, always at night, always just loud enough to be unsettling. One night, as we were drifting off to sleep, there was a deep, guttural sound from the hallway. It was a single word, barely above a whisper. "Leave." I sat up, heart pounding, and glanced at Nora, who looked just as terrified as I felt. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, clutching my arm. I nodded, and we stayed frozen in bed, listening. But the house had gone completely silent, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. Things escalated after that. Lights flickered randomly throughout the day, and Nora started complaining of feeling watched. She told me she'd catch glimpses of a shadow at the edge of her vision, a figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to vanish whenever she turned to face it. I never saw it myself, but the fear in her eyes made me believe. Then came the mirrors. It was Nora who noticed it first. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she looked in the bathroom mirror and saw herself smiling back, a wide, unnatural grin. Only, she wasn't smiling at all. Her reflection's eyes were hollow, black voids, and the skin around its mouth stretched too far, almost tearing at the corners. She screamed and stumbled out of the bathroom, crashing into me as I rushed to see what was wrong. By the time I looked in the mirror, everything seemed normal. But after that, Nora refused to look in a mirror, claiming that her reflection seemed to watch her. The next few days passed in a haze of fear. We barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. Then one evening, while putting some boxes in the basement, I stumbled across something I hadn't noticed before. A door at the far end of the basement wall, hidden behind a dusty tarp. Curious, I pulled the tarp away and tried the handle. It was locked. I felt a strange compulsion to open it, so I fetched a crowbar from my toolbox and pried the door open. Behind it was a dark, narrow staircase leading down even further, into what looked like an old, forgotten cellar. A chill ran down my spine, and my instincts told me to close the door and walk away. But something drew me down those stairs, step by step, until I reached the bottom. The air was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell, like rust or old blood. I could barely make out the shapes in the darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was standing in a room lined with strange symbols, painted or carved into the walls. And then I saw them, 2 wooden chairs, facing each other in the center of the room. Thick chains hung from the ceiling above each chair, as if meant to hold someone in place. An ancient, thick layer of dust covered everything, suggesting that nobody had been down here in decades. I felt a knot of dread in my stomach and turned to leave, but something stopped me. On the floor between the 2 chairs lay a torn piece of paper, yellowed with age. Scrawled in frantic handwriting were the words, "Do not bring her here, she sees you." That night I told Nora about the cellar, and she looked horrified. She begged me to nail the door shut and forget it existed, so I did. But whatever was in that room, it didn't like being shut away. The next night, we were woken up by a banging sound coming from the basement. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone pounding their fists against the locked cellar door. I got up, clutching a flashlight, and made my way downstairs, dreading what I might find. As I reached the basement, the banging stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper, echoing up from the locked door. It was a language I didn't recognize, but it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the whisper stopped, and the basement went dead silent. I turned and bolted back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. Over the next few days, Nora's behavior started to change. She became distant, her skin pale and eyes sunken. She stopped sleeping, muttering to herself about the woman who was watching her. Then she began to scratch at her own skin, leaving red marks along her arms, saying she needed to let her out. One night, I found her standing in front of our bedroom mirror, whispering to her own reflection. I heard her say, "You can come in now," in a voice that wasn't quite hers. She turned to me, her eyes hollow and filled with a strange malice, and smiled. "I've let her in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then she collapsed. That night, I didn't sleep at all, sitting by her side, hoping she'd wake up herself again. When morning came, she seemed to return to normal, but I could tell something had changed. She avoided mirrors, flinched at the sound of creaking floorboards, and muttered under her breath whenever she thought I wasn't listening. I realized we couldn't stay here. The house was wearing us down, breaking us little by little. I wanted to get Nora away, but every time I suggested leaving, she grew furious, screaming that she couldn't leave, that she wouldn't let her. One night, I woke up to find Nora gone. I searched the entire house, eventually finding her in the basement, standing in front of the cellar door, scratching at the wood until her fingers bled. She turned to me with vacant eyes and said, "She's waiting. I have to let her out." I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed her by the shoulders and dragged her upstairs, locking the basement door behind us. She fought, clawing at me, shrieking that she was so close. The next day, I found someone willing to perform a house cleansing. They arrived just before dusk, and as they walked through each room, they grew increasingly disturbed. When they reached the basement, they stopped, turning to me with wide eyes. "This is pure evil," they said. "Whatever is in this house is ancient, malevolent. It's feeding off you." They blessed the house, chanting words I couldn't understand as the walls seemed to pulse and throb. The lights flickered and the air grew thick and oppressive, but as they finished, a sense of calm seemed to wash over us. Since then, the house has been quiet. The basement remains locked, and we avoid it at all costs. Nora never fully recovered, though. She's quieter now, her eyes always glancing toward shadows. She says she can still hear whispers sometimes, faint and distant, calling her back to that locked door. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the mirrors. A dark figure, watching, waiting for the day we'll let her out again. We'd been living in the city for as long as I could remember, and so the decision to move to the countryside was a bold one. My wife, Rachel, and I had dreamed of a quiet life for our kids, Evan and Kelly, somewhere with fresh air and room to grow. When we found a small farmhouse nestled between hills and thick forests, it seemed like the perfect escape. The house was a cozy 2-story structure that had been empty for some time. From the moment we arrived, we noticed the stillness around it. There were no birds chirping, no rustling in the nearby woods, just silence. But the real oddity was in the far corner of the yard, where an old, abandoned well sat, its cover rotted and half sunken into the earth. The first few days were peaceful, almost idyllic. We spent time settling in, exploring the trails through the woods, and getting to know our new space. But on the 5th day, things started to change. It was just after dawn when I noticed the faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I assumed it was something outside, a branch tapping against a window or the sound of animals moving around. But it continued, growing louder, echoing through the house at odd intervals, as if something, or someone, was moving through the walls. One evening, As we were sitting in the living room, Rachel froze, her gaze fixed on the doorway. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't, but her reaction made my stomach turn. "Hear what?" She hesitated. "A child laughing." We brushed it off as an overactive imagination until it happened again. The laughter would come and go at night, floating softly through the hallways and seeping under closed doors. It was like a distant echo, a reminder of something long forgotten. The kids hadn't mentioned anything strange, so we tried to ignore it. But that night, I woke to Kelly crying in her room. I rushed over to find her sitting up in bed, her tiny frame shaking. "What happened, honey?" I asked, wrapping my arms around her. "There was a girl in my room," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "She was sitting by my bed, staring at me." I tried to comfort her, brushing it off as a bad dream. But deep down, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. From that night on, Kelly refused to sleep in her own room, and I didn't press her. Something didn't feel right. A week later, I noticed that the smell in the house had changed. It was a sickly sweet stench, like decaying flowers mixed with something metallic. We checked every corner, every nook, but there was no source, no reason for the odor. Then came the knocking. It started lightly, like fingertips tapping on the walls. It was always at night, growing louder and more insistent as the hours wore on. Sometimes it was rhythmic, almost like a code. Other times it was frantic, as if someone was desperately trying to get in. The worst part was that the knocking always seemed to come from different parts of the house, moving from room to room. And then, one night, it was right outside our bedroom door. The sound was so loud, so violent, that I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. "Maybe we should call someone," Rachel whispered, clutching my arm. But who would we call? I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't deny what we were experiencing. The next morning, we woke to find that the door to the old well had been torn open. I had nailed it shut after we moved in, to keep the kids from going near it. But there it was. The board splintered, as if something had clawed its way out. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on us. The air grew cold, and shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, stretching and shifting, taking shapes that defied logic. I thought I saw faces, distorted, twisted, with empty eyes watching us. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost like the gentle hum of a lullaby. I looked over at Rachel, who was fast asleep, and then at the kids' closed door. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, and I felt a presence standing by the bed. I didn't dare move. My skin prickled, and every instinct told me to keep still. Then a hand reached out from the darkness. It was pale, almost translucent, its long fingers stretching toward me. I gasped, scrambling out of bed, but the hand vanished, melting into the shadows. I shook Rachel awake, barely able to form words, and together we rushed to check on the kids. Both were fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror lurking in the dark. Over the next few days, we tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the shadows continued to follow us, creeping along the walls, shifting underfoot, always watching. Evan started talking to someone we couldn't see, claiming it was a friend who visited him at night. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I wanted to leave, to take my family far from that place. But something held us there, as if the house itself didn't want to let us go. Then one evening, as the kids were playing in the living room, the lights began to flicker. The temperature plummeted, and a thick fog seeped in from the hallway, filling the air with that sickly sweet stench. "Look," Kelly whispered, pointing to the far corner. There, in the shadows, stood a figure, a girl no older than 10, her dress tattered and covered in dirt. Her face was gaunt, her eyes empty pits, black as coal. She raised a hand, pointing directly at us, her mouth stretching into a twisted grin. Before I could react, she vanished, leaving nothing but an icy chill in her wake. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the kids' door, clutching a flashlight, listening to the faint whispers and the gentle tapping that filled the house. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump, my nerves frayed and raw. By dawn, I had made up my mind. We had to leave. We packed what we could, moving through the house in silence, our eyes darting to every shadow. As we passed the old well, I felt a pull, a strange compulsion to look inside. Against my better judgment, I lifted the rotted cover and peered down. At the bottom, barely visible in the murky darkness, was the figure of a girl, her arms outstretched, her face twisted in agony. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her empty eyes stared directly at me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and pulled Rachel and the kids toward the car. We drove away without looking back, the shadows of that house lingering in my mind. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, hearing faint whispers and the soft tapping of fingers on the walls. I've caught glimpses of shadows in the corners of my vision, a constant reminder that something, some part of that house, has followed us. And at times, when the night is still and the air grows cold, I feel a presence beside me, waiting, as if it's only a matter of time before the shadows come back for us. When we first saw the Briarwood house, it was a rainy afternoon, and the world seemed to blur in shades of grey. My husband, Thomas, and I were eager to escape the noise of the city, searching for peace in the countryside. Briarwood, with its towering oaks and expansive fields, promised just that. The house itself was an old Victorian, its windows dark, its porch sagging slightly with age, but it had charm. From the moment we stepped inside, I felt the air grow heavier. I convinced myself it was just the stale atmosphere of a house long abandoned. But it was more than that. The first few days passed uneventfully as we settled in. It wasn't until the 5th night that things began to change. I woke up to a strange noise, a faint scratching coming from within the walls. At first, I thought it might be mice, but the sound was too deliberate, almost like nails dragging slowly across the wooden beams. I nudged Thomas awake, but by the time he stirred, the sound had stopped. "Probably just the wind," he mumbled, pulling the covers over his head. But I wasn't convinced. The next day, as I unpacked boxes in the living room, I noticed something odd. The air felt cooler near the fireplace, and no matter how close I got to the hearth, the chill wouldn't go away. Later, as I was arranging books on the old wooden shelves, a faint, floral scent wafted through the room, like roses left to wither. It lingered for only a moment, then disappeared as quickly as it came. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to move from wall to wall, like something trying to find a way out. I tried to ignore it, but then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo through the house. I strained my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. The following day, I went into the attic. It was dusty, filled with forgotten relics of the past, old furniture, trunks, and faded photographs. As I rummaged through a box, I found a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting elegant but hurried. The entries spoke of a woman named Eliza, who once lived in Briarwood. Her words became more frantic with each page, detailing her descent into paranoia. She wrote of shadows that moved on their own, of voices that whispered her name, and of something she called the Watcher, a presence that lingered in the house, watching her every move. As I read, a chill ran down my spine. The last entry was smeared, as if written in haste. The Watcher is here. It knows I see it. That night, I told Thomas about the journal. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a troubled mind, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We tried to go to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate and heavy, as if someone was pacing just outside our door. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Thomas nodded, his face pale. We sat in silence, listening as the footsteps stopped, followed by a faint knocking at the door. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of breathing, low, raspy, and inhuman. Summoning his courage, Thomas got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with the scent of roses. Over the next few days, the house seemed to come alive. Doors opened and closed on their own, lights flickered, and objects moved inexplicably. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, speaking of things long buried, secrets meant to stay hidden. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the fireplace roared to life on its own. The flames danced wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the flickering light, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes that burned like embers. I screamed, but when Thomas turned, the figure was gone. We decided we couldn't stay in Briarwood any longer. We packed our things, ready to leave the next morning. But the house had other plans. That night, the walls trembled, and the whispers became a cacophony of voices. The scratching turned to pounding, as if something was trying to break free. Then, the rose scent returned, overwhelming and suffocating. I clutched Thomas, tears streaming down my face. "We have to go now," I pleaded. But as we tried to leave, the front door wouldn't budge. It felt as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Desperate, we ran to the back door, only to find it locked as well. The windows refused to open, trapping us inside. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. In the corner of the room, the figure reappeared. This time, it stepped forward, revealing a face twisted in anguish, its mouth stretched in a silent scream. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, suffocating dread wash over me. The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the attic. It wanted us to follow. Reluctantly, we ascended the creaking stairs, each step heavier than the last. The attic door swung open on its own, revealing the old trunk I had found the journal in. Inside, we discovered a small, ornate box. It was sealed with a heavy lock, which crumbled to dust at our touch. Inside the box was a locket and a bundle of letters, tied with a crimson ribbon. The letters were from Eliza, detailing her torment and the dark rituals she believed would free her from the Watcher. But it was too late for her. The final letter spoke of her surrender to the darkness. Holding the locket, I felt a surge of energy, a connection to the past. I whispered a prayer, clutching the locket tightly. The air in the attic grew warmer, the whispers fading into nothingness. When we finally managed to leave Briarwood, the house stood silent behind us, its shadows retreating into the past. We never returned, but I kept the locket as a reminder of the darkness we faced. A token of the unseen horrors that lurk in forgotten places. Even now, I sometimes wake in the dead of night, the faint scent of roses lingering in the air, and I wonder if the watcher is still there, waiting for someone else to uncover its secrets. I never believed in the supernatural. I was a man of logic, reason, and practicality. But all that changed when we moved to Willow Creek. My wife Jessica and I had just purchased an old Victorian house at the edge of town. It was a beautiful, if slightly decrepit, structure with tall spires and ornate woodwork. The realtor had mentioned its history, a few decades old, having passed through several owners. What they didn't mention were the whispers about its haunted reputation. Our first night in the house was uneventful, though a sense of unease hung in the air. The wind howled through the trees, and the house creaked under the strain of age. Jessica and I chalked it up to the quirks of an old home and went to bed early, exhausted from the move. The second night was when things began to take a turn. I awoke to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other critter in the walls. But as I listened, the scratching seemed deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if something was trying to get in. I shook it off and went back to sleep, convinced it was nothing. The following morning, I noticed something strange. A dark stain had appeared on the wall in the living room, a long, jagged mark that hadn't been there before. Jessica shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an old water stain surfacing due to the house's age. But the mark unsettled me. It looked more like a burn than a water stain. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. I got up, flashlight in hand, and followed the sound to the basement door. The air grew colder as I descended the creaky steps. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but old boxes and cobwebs. The scratching stopped as soon as I reached the bottom. I lingered for a moment before heading back upstairs, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Jessica began to change. She grew distant. Her usually vibrant eyes dulled with a strange emptiness. She would wake up in the middle of the night, staring out the window into the dark woods that bordered our property. When I asked her what she was looking at, she would only say, "They're watching." I didn't know who or what they were, but her behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. She started speaking in her sleep, mumbling words in a language I couldn't understand. Her voice would drop to a guttural, almost inhuman tone. It terrified me. One night, I woke to find Jessica standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide open but blank. Her lips moved silently, as if reciting a prayer or chant. I tried to wake her, but she didn't respond. Finally, she let out a blood-curdling scream and collapsed onto the bed. The next day, she didn't remember a thing. The house seemed to take on a life of its own. Doors would slam shut on their own, footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and shadowy figures flitted just out of sight. The worst was the attic. Neither of us had dared to go up there, but strange noises emanated from above, thudding, whispers, and an occasional childlike giggle. One evening, I mustered the courage to explore the attic. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, flashlight in hand. The attic was filled with old furniture, dusty trunks, and a sense of suffocating darkness. In the far corner, I found a small wooden box. It was intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Inside the box was a collection of old photographs. They depicted a family, parents and 2 young children. In each photograph, their faces were blurred, obscured by shadows. The last photo showed the family standing in front of the house, their eyes pitch black. That night, Jessica grew worse. She was pale, trembling, and muttering about the shadows. I didn't know what to do, so I held her, whispering that everything would be okay, though I didn't believe it myself. The following night, it all came to a head. I woke to the sound of Jessica screaming. I found her in the living room, staring at the wall where the stain had been. Blood oozed from the cracks in the wood, pooling on the floor. Her eyes were wide with terror as she pointed at the wall, shouting, "They're coming!" The room grew icy cold, and the lights flickered before going out completely. In the darkness, I could see shapes moving, shadowy figures with glowing red eyes. They surrounded us, whispering in that same guttural language Jessica had spoken in her sleep. I grabbed her and ran, bolting out the front door into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, gasping for breath under the pale light of the moon. We didn't return to Willow Creek. We left everything behind, our belongings, our home, and the nightmares that lived within its walls. We later learned that the house had a dark past. The family in the photographs had vanished without a trace, and every subsequent owner had experienced strange occurrences before leaving in a hurry. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something malevolent had attached itself to us. In the dead of night, I sometimes hear whispers and feel the cold touch of unseen hands. Jessica never speaks of what happened, but her eyes still hold that haunted look. We moved far away, but the memories and the shadows followed us. When James and I first laid eyes on Blackwood Manor, it felt like stepping into a dream. The sprawling estate was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, with ivy crawling up its weathered stone walls and a view of the distant hills that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place we'd always talked about, a house with history, charm, and endless possibilities. We moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was filled with the scent of fallen leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun bathed the house in a warm glow. It felt perfect, like we were exactly where we were meant to be. But that feeling didn't last long. The first few nights were peaceful, filled with the comforting sounds of an old house settling into its bones. But on the fourth night, as we were unpacking the last of the boxes, I noticed something strange. In the hallway just outside our bedroom, there was a large ornate mirror, a relic left behind by the previous owners. In its glass, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. "Just tired," I muttered to myself, brushing it off. A week later, James and I were enjoying a quiet evening in the living room when we heard it for the first time. The faint sound of footsteps above us. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. The house had an attic, but we hadn't been up there yet. "I'll check it out," James said, grabbing a flashlight. I followed him up the creaky wooden stairs to the attic door. It groaned open, revealing a space filled with dust and cobwebs. The air was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe. We found nothing out of the ordinary, just old furniture covered in sheets and forgotten boxes of belongings. "Probably just the house settling," James reassured me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors would open and close on their own. Lights flickered even though the wiring had been recently inspected, and cold spots appeared in random parts of the house. The worst was the feeling of being watched. No matter where we were, it felt like unseen eyes were always on us, lurking just beyond our sight. One night, I woke up to find James standing at the window, staring out into the dark forest. "James, what are you doing?" I whispered. He didn't respond at first, just stood there, unmoving. Finally, he turned to me, his face pale and expressionless. "They're out there," he said in a flat, emotionless voice. "Who's out there?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The shadows," he replied, his eyes distant. The next day, James had no memory of the incident. But I could see the toll the house was taking on him. He was becoming more withdrawn, more anxious. The breaking point came one stormy night. We were both jolted awake by the sound of heavy footsteps running down the hallway. We rushed out of bed, only to find the hallway empty. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the mirror again. The same one where I'd first seen the shadow. This time, there was no mistaking it. The glass rippled like water, and a dark figure with hollow, glowing eyes stared back at me. We decided we couldn't stay another night. But as we packed our bags, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the lights flickered uncontrollably, and the temperature plummeted. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Desperate, we made our way to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was trying to keep us inside. Panic set in as the sounds of whispers filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. "James, what do we do?" I cried. He grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the back door. Miraculously, it opened without resistance, and we stumbled out into the cold night, gasping for air. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the forest. Turning back, we saw the house looming in the darkness, its windows glowing with an eerie light. The whispers continued, carrying on the wind, urging us to return. We never went back. We sold the house to a developer who planned to tear it down, but part of me wonders if the shadows of Blackwood Manor will ever truly be gone. Even now, in the safety of our new home, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear those same whispers calling out to me, reminding me that some places are never meant to be lived in. Moving into our new home was supposed to be the start of a fresh chapter. Amy and I had found the place after months of searching. A charming, albeit old, house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. The place had character, creaky wooden floors, ornate fixtures, and a warmth that felt inviting. We were excited to make it our own. For the first couple of weeks, everything was blissfully normal. We unpacked boxes, painted walls, and spent our evenings curled up on the couch, watching TV. Life was simple, peaceful. That peace shattered on an otherwise quiet Thursday evening. We were halfway through a movie, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of the screen, when a loud crash erupted from the kitchen. Amy and I shot up from the couch, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "What the hell was that?" I muttered, heart racing. Together, we hurried to the kitchen, expecting to find a broken glass or perhaps a dish that had been precariously balanced on the edge of the counter. But when we arrived, nothing seemed out of place. No shards of glass, no evidence of anything falling. "Maybe it was something outside," Amy suggested, though her voice trembled slightly. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. We checked the rest of the house but found nothing amiss. Eventually we brushed it off as a random noise, an old house settling into its bones. A few nights later, the strangeness returned, this time more aggressively. We were deep asleep when a sudden loud thud jolted us awake. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway outside our bedroom. They were slow, methodical, as if someone, or something, was deliberately making its presence known. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Amy clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," I whispered. As I crept toward the bedroom door, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Just as I reached for the doorknob, a door somewhere in the house slammed shut with such force that the walls seemed to tremble. I threw the door open, ready to confront whatever intruder had entered our home. But the hallway was empty. Every door was shut tight, except for the one leading to the basement. It stood ajar, its darkness yawning like a gaping maw. "Did you see anything?" Amy whispered from behind me. I shook my head, my grip tightening on the bat. "Stay here. I'm checking the basement." The descent into the basement felt like stepping into another world. The air was colder, heavier. Each step echoed loudly, as if the basement were amplifying the sound. I flicked on the light, expecting to see a raccoon or some other animal that had somehow gotten in. But there was nothing. Nothing except an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I quickly retreated back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. Amy was waiting in the living room, pale and visibly shaken. "We need to call someone," she said. "A priest, a medium, someone who can help us." I agreed, though I wasn't entirely sure what I believed. That night we slept with the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. The next few days were relatively quiet, but the tension lingered. We tried to return to normalcy, though every evening felt like walking into a trap. And then it escalated again. One night, around 3 a.m., we were awakened by a guttural growl emanating from somewhere within the house. It was deep, inhuman, and filled with an unmistakable malice. The growl was followed by a scratching sound, as if nails were being dragged across the walls. Amy clung to me, trembling. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, though fear gripped me as tightly as it did her. The scratching stopped, replaced by whispers, soft, unintelligible, but undeniably there. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. We couldn't stay in the house any longer. That morning, we packed a bag and left, seeking refuge at a nearby hotel. I called a paranormal investigator I'd found online, desperate for answers. The investigator, an older woman named Lorraine, arrived the next day. She listened to our story with a grave expression, nodding occasionally. "This house, it has a presence," she said. "Something dark. It feeds on fear, on chaos." Lorraine performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers. The air in the house felt lighter afterward, but the unease never fully left us. That night, we returned, hoping the worst was behind us. For a while, it seemed like it was. But around midnight, as we lay in bed, the whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder. "We need to leave," Amy whispered, tears streaming down her face. I agreed. This time we didn't pack. We just grabbed our keys and left, vowing never to return. We eventually sold the house, at a significant loss, to a buyer who claimed he didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't care. We just wanted to be rid of it. Even now, in our new home, miles away from that cursed place, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of those whispers, those footsteps that growl. I can't help but wonder if whatever was in that house has truly let us go, or if it's still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. When we moved to the old farmhouse that winter, it felt like we were stepping into a peaceful new life. My wife, Emily, and our 2 kids, Jonah and Emma, were eager for a change from the city, and I loved the idea of raising them surrounded by nature. It was quiet too, far from any other houses and surrounded by woods. For the first few nights, it was perfect. But then things took a strange turn. It began one day in the attic. I was up there moving boxes when I noticed a low humming sound. I thought maybe it was an old appliance left plugged in somewhere. As I got closer to the source, I found myself in front of the attic's single dusty window. And there they were, flies. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, buzzing angrily against the glass and crawling over each other like they were fighting to get out. It didn't make sense. It was freezing outside, but they kept coming. Emily and I brushed it off, figuring the flies had somehow gotten trapped. We bought a few fly swatters and spent an entire weekend getting rid of them, swatting at flies that always seemed to find their way back. But the problem persisted. Every time we thought we'd gotten them all, another swarm would appear. Then the noises started. At first, it was just the occasional knock, soft, almost like the sound of branches brushing against the house. But then, it grew louder. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to 3 distinct heavy knocks on our bedroom door. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, gripping my arm. She was wide awake, her face pale in the dim light. I nodded, my heart racing as I waited for another knock. Silence. I climbed out of bed, opened the door, and peered into the dark hallway, but nothing was there. The kids were asleep, and the house was quiet. "Probably just the house settling," I whispered, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The next few nights were eerily quiet, but the knocking came back, this time right next to the kids' room. I went in, expecting to find Jonah or Emma awake and scared, but they were sound asleep. That's when I noticed their closet door slightly ajar. It slowly creaked open, inch by inch, as if someone were pushing it from the inside. I closed it quickly, and that night, we decided to let the kids sleep in our room. Over the following weeks, things grew worse. The flies multiplied, the knocks grew louder, and strange, cold drafts filled the rooms no matter how high we turned up the heat. Emily, usually so full of energy, became withdrawn and exhausted. She said she'd been having terrible nightmares, and sometimes she'd wake up convinced that someone was standing at the foot of the bed, just staring at her. Then one evening, Emma mentioned a friend who came to visit her at night. She said he looked like a tall man with dark eyes who watched her while she slept. She even told me he liked to stand in the corner, just watching. At first, I dismissed it as a child's imagination, but then I saw him too. Late one night, I was standing in the hallway when I glanced upstairs and saw a figure peering down at me from the shadows. His face was stretched and pale, his eyes sunken with a faint, menacing glow. He vanished as soon as I blinked, but I could still feel his gaze, cold and heavy, lingering in the darkness. Then, one night, everything came to a terrifying climax. It was after midnight, and Emily and I were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, when the entire house seemed to shudder. The walls shook with a loud, frantic pounding, like someone running down the stairs at full speed. Chairs slid across the floor, the lights flickered wildly, and a thick, dark liquid started to seep from the walls. The sight was horrifying. The liquid looked like blood, oozing in thick, viscous streams, staining the wallpaper as it crept down to the floor. The smell was sharp and metallic, filling the air and making it nearly impossible to breathe. Emily looked at me, wide-eyed and shaking. And for the first time, I saw genuine terror on her face. That night, we slept with the lights on, too afraid to even close our eyes. The next day, Emily called her aunt, who had always been a spiritual person, someone who believed in things we didn't fully understand. When she told her what was happening, her aunt went quiet before recommending we speak with a priest she knew. She told us, "He's seen things like this before," and though I felt ridiculous, we were desperate. Father Vincent arrived 2 days later, his expression serious as he walked through each room, stopping to whisper prayers and sprinkle holy water on the walls. When he entered the attic, he paused, his face pale. He turned to us and said, "This house holds something dark, something that doesn't want you here." He explained that he would perform a blessing to drive the presence out, but he couldn't guarantee it would be gone for good. As he prayed, the air grew thick and cold, and a faint whisper echoed through the house, low and guttural like a growl. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching us with those same hollow, glowing eyes. After what felt like hours, Father Vincent finally finished. He looked exhausted, but he reassured us that he'd done all he could. "I've pushed it back," he said, his voice shaky, "but whatever it is, it's strong. It may still be here, waiting." For a few weeks, everything felt calm again. The flies vanished, the knocking stopped, and the air felt lighter. But every so often, especially late at night, I feel that same cold presence, lurking just out of sight. And sometimes, I still hear faint whispers in the attic, like an echo from the past. I know we haven't seen the last of whatever haunted us. You've stayed till the end, brave soul. Bloody subscribe, and I'll see you in your nightmares. Good night.